So, hello everybody. Welcome to the third of four special events associated with the 2014 version of the copyright course here at Harvard and the 2014 Copyright X course, which is going on at the same time. So our speakers this evening are four principals in the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, organization I'm also myself heavily involved in. I'm going to say a few words about Berkman Center, for the few of you who may not be familiar with it, then a few words about our speakers, and then we will launch. So here's the format for the evening. After the introductions, I am going to pose some questions to each of our speakers, asking them to remark on dimensions of the copyright regime that are pertinent to their disciplines. So as I say, that'll take about half an hour to explore these issues. And then the bulk of the time, we will respond to questions, both questions from you here, and as is conventional in these events, to questions posed via this iPad from the online participants. So that's the plan. The Berkman Center, as many, but not all of you know, is a research institute here at Harvard. Was founded at the law school, but for roughly a decade now, it's been an interfaculty initiative. And the folks involved in it, both at the faculty level and at the fellows level and at the student level, come from many different schools within the university. The folks here tonight represent a broad cross-section of the disciplines in the center. So on your far right, first, is Felix Oberholzer-G, who is currently a professor at the Harvard Business School. He obtained his PhD in economics at the University of Zurich, thereafter managed a process control company in Switzerland, and then decided to go foolishly into teaching. He came to the United States teaching first at the Wharton School, where he won a bunch of teaching awards, and then most recently came to the Harvard Business School, where he is currently the Andreas Anderson Professor of Business Administration. Among his many specialties is business in China. He teaches several executive education courses there, and one of the topics I hope to take up tonight is the role of intellectual property in China. Next to him is Stuart Schieber. Stuart's principal appointment here at Harvard is in the School for Engineering and Applied Sciences, which is a somewhat confusing name for computer science.
Well, no, there's more than just computer science. It's all of engineering. All of engineering.
Yes, there are many things involved, and your own background reflects the diversity. So he was initially trained in mathematics here at Harvard, then in computer science at Stanford, and is now, if I get it right, the Welsh Professor of Computer Science, both in the School for Engineering and Applied Sciences and in its parent institution, which is the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. His specialty is computational linguistics, which I confess I don't really understand. But it seems to involve the study of how and why languages can efficiently communicate information. Lurking there is a hypothesis that they do efficiently communicate information. But in addressing that theme, he draws upon many disciplines, including, not surprisingly, computer science and linguistics, but also psychology and artificial intelligence. He is, in addition, the holder of several patents, the founder of 2 successful companies, and finally, an axis germane to our discussion this evening, is the leader of the initiative to require that overstates it slightly, Harvard faculty to make their scholarship available to the world in near final form online for free. So this movement come to be known as open publishing or open scholarship took root at Harvard and is now spread to many other institutions, and that's one of the themes we're likely to take up this evening. Next to him is Jeffrey Schnapp, who came to us here at Harvard via, again, Stanford, where he was the Perotti Chair in Italian Literature and the founder of the Stanford Humanities Lab. Those two words don't go together very comfortably, humanities and lab. How they intersect is one of the issues I think we'll address tonight. Since 2010, he has been here at Harvard as a professor of Romance languages and literatures, and also on the faculty of the School of Architecture and the Graduate School of Design. His affiliation with the Berkman Center includes his responsibility for first creating and then bringing under our umbrella Meta Lab, which continues to carry on the work he did at Stanford under the general heading of Digital Humanities. And last but not least, next to me is Chris Bavitz. Chris is the only lawyer on the panel. Chris got his BA at Tufts, his law degree at the University of Michigan. He then served in a law firm for 5 years. And then the experience probably most germane to our inquiries tonight, he was the Senior Director of Legal Affairs for EMI Music. So deep understanding of the recording industry. He is now a clinical professor at Harvard Law School and runs the Berkman Center Clinic. So he will be able to speak to the practical dimension of copyright in the context of, at a minimum, music and more broadly the entertainment industry. Okay, so that's the cast of characters. So Stuart, let's start with you. What, if anything, is the role, or should be the role, of copyright in managing the production and dissemination of academic scholarship?
You know, I was going to take a minute before I answered that question to explain what computational linguistics is. But then I decided instead, what you can do is just go to my website. All my papers are openly available on the website. You can just read them. Which brings me to the answer to your question, which was about the role of copyright in academic writing.
Right.
So it's interesting that I think there's nuance in this idea of copyright in academic writing. If you look to first principles, which I'm always want to do, and think about the idea behind copyright. The idea behind copyright is a social contract. Students, I'm sure, know this very well. This is the topic of the course. It's a social contract in which we, the citizens of the country, provide a kind of a payment to authors in terms of exclusive rights of a certain sort for a limited period of time, maybe not so limited anymore, in return for obtaining the benefit of the creative expression and incentivizing the creative expression of the creators. And I'm a big fan of this idea of social contract and therefore copyright, but more the social contract than copyright per se. In certain areas, the copyright is important to that social contract, but academia is an interesting area because that's an area where the idea of exploiting exclusive rights for direct financial benefit isn't needed in order to incentivize the writing. May or may not be the only such area, I'm not sure. Perhaps there are other areas where you don't need that incentive, that direct financial, and I don't want to give the impression that academics like me and some of the other, I don't want to speak for everybody, but academics like me don't need financial incentive. That's not the issue. The issue is whether the financial incentive is direct. Are you directly paid for your writing? And of course, we're not directly paid for our writing in general. For the primary, people may not realize this, but when academics write articles and publish them in journals, that's the primary mode in many fields for how we get our research results out. We're not paid any royalties for that. Zero. That doesn't mean that we get no benefit. If we got no benefit, we wouldn't do it. We get indirect financial benefit because our careers depend on, and our advancement, our careers depend on impact of our research, and the way we get impact is getting people to read what we write, and to do that we have to publish the articles. So it's interesting. So now, but it raises a question. If you see, nothing in that story requires exclusive rights and the access limitation that exclusive rights allow in order to make the whole process work. And in fact, you could imagine a system where the way the social contract worked was different. We're paid to be academics. For instance, I get a research grant to do some research, and a funding agency pays me to do the research. The social contract could be that in return for that money, I will make my writings openly available. And that wouldn't bother me at all, because I'm not getting paid anyway for those writings. So it's an interesting situation where the social contract, the idea of the social contract of payment for benefiting society doesn't require the kind of monopoly that copyright is based on. So this is the idea behind open access that, Terry, you were referring to, that, that we could set up the system differently and get the same benefit, in fact, a bigger benefit to society in this particular area of academic writing, not necessarily all areas where copyright impinges. So in particular, entertainment industry doesn't work like that. I shouldn't speak for Chris. Maybe you'll tell me if it does work like that. I don't know. And a lot of the research, tell me just how, I talked a lot, Lana. I probably talked a lot. I've gotten the idea across.
You definitely got the idea across. Sorry, here's some follow-up questions.
I can keep talking about this forever.
Let's assume we're persuaded. Seems hard to dispute. One possible implication of your point would be there ought to be a change in the law. We should change the copyright regime so as to withdraw copyright protection for academic scholarship in much the same way that the Supreme Court is currently at least considering withdrawing patent protection from certain kinds of inventions that they think don't need the incentive of patent law, like business methods, for example. So we could change the law. But why do we need to change the law? Why don't we collectively, as academics, if we are not dependent on this regime, forego an unnecessary right? As you point out, it's not earning us any money. Why don't we collectively give it up across the board, and that way we wouldn't have to go through all of the difficulties at the national or international level of modifying the law?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think if there were only two stakeholders in this transaction, let's say research funders who fund the academics and the academics who do the research, I think we would do that. In fact, I think we would have done that long ago. But there are other stakeholders involved, namely the publishers of the journals in which these articles appear, and they currently play a central role in the whole publishing process. And that role involves, among other things, not just the kind of the direct activity of publishing, but also the branding of the articles that they publish with the imprimatur of the journal. And that branding is very important to the authors. They really want that. And that leads to a kind of momentum in the system that's very hard to break.
Okay. Great. That seems plenty. You're right that we could proceed down this road a long distance and probably will in the question and answer period. But let's get some more issues on the table first. Felix. Completely different axis here. Lawyers who advise innovative firms very commonly urge them to secure promptly strong intellectual property protections for their innovations and then enforce them, if necessary, through litigation. You've suggested in a variety of contexts that that's not always a good idea. In fact, it is often an affirmatively bad idea. Can you give a few, actually one would probably be enough, examples of circumstances in which the conventional perspective of most of the people in the room and a significant percentage of the people watching online is wrong-headed?
I'd be happy to, since I think a lot about these issues. So in general, I think most business people, as probably many people who are experts in the law, think of the value of intellectual property generally, and then of copyright in particular, as the ability to exert market power. So you raise prices, this is the social cost that you alluded to, and as a result, fewer consumers buy. But the argument goes, oh, we wouldn't have the product or we wouldn't have the service in the first place if it wasn't for these financial incentives. And so the idea is, what are the circumstances under which this backfires, in the sense that the profit-maximizing firm, the managers who first and foremost think about themselves, if they want to get the most out of their IP, is it always a good idea to exert market power? And a few examples that show why this is not always the case involve, say, industries with network effects. Network effects are effects that make products more valuable if more people use it. So think about Facebook. If you're the only person on Facebook, probably not such a great service. So over large numbers of people, certainly until the point where your mother joins Facebook, the more people, the better. And so if the success of your business depends on mass adoption, exerting market power, keeping prices high, and therefore limiting the size of the audience is a bad idea. Maybe the most dramatic example that we have in at least recent business history is the near bankruptcy of Apple, that at one point in time was the leading firm in the personal computing space. And so, they had everything. They had the great product. They had a quite sizable technological advantage. And so you might ask, oh, why is it that that's not the standard? And the reason why this is not the standard is that they kept prices high. As a result, the audience was relatively small. If I was a software developer, it made little sense to produce software for Apple. As a result, all the great software was available for IBM and IBM-compatible machines. And the market share of Apple basically went to zero. So this is an instance in which network effects are strong enough to almost make the firm fail because it doesn't have a sizable audience. There are other examples. So think of a video game platform. If the Xbox was priced exorbitantly high because I have fabulous IP that allows me to only sell to a small group of customers with very high willingness to pay. Probably not a very good idea, because I will have very few games for that particular platform because, again, the size of the audience is small.
Yeah. Let's pursue the Apple example just a couple steps further. As you pointed out in some other contexts, Apple is no longer bankrupt, doing pretty well. Certainly in the academic setting, and certainly in the United States, you look around and see all these gleaming laptops. So I'll ask a composite question. What's the relationship between Apple's success nowadays and this issue? And did it reflect a flash of insight on the part of the managers or luck?
part of it is great product quality, right? So when you think about the iPod first, and then the iPad eventually, the iPhone, these are great products. But the early Apple history is very interesting in that it shows, oh, the great product alone is not going to do it. In particular, in that space, it's important that you have the something else. And so we might ask, what was the something else that, say, made Apple so successful in the market for MP3 players, the iPod? One real interesting argument in our context tonight is that in this case, weakening copyright is a direct benefit to Apple as a firm. Why? Well, you know, the price of content basically goes to zero. Of course, no one here in the audience, but the rest of humanity has stopped paying for music by and large. If the price of the complement falls to zero, I can charge a higher price for the other product, which in this case happens to be the product that Apple produces. So again, some sort of counterintuitive story relative to how we usually think about property rights. So typically we see property rights weaker, falling prices. Oh my God, falling prices are bad news for business people because it's harder to make money. Well, not if you're in the market for complements. Products and services that benefit from the availability of other products that happen to be really cheap. So think, if you go to the movies, the full price of going to the movies is the movie ticket and the popcorn and so on, and everything else you consume. And so shifting around profit pools between these product categories can benefit one or the other. In that sense, weakening copyright is, in this case for Apple at least, was great news. In fact, helped the firm substantially finance the transition towards Intel chips. That was a very expensive undertaking.
Okay, so this is actually provides a nice bridge to Chris's work. Let me caricature the resultant situation a bit. The combination of the inability of the legal system to accommodate the increasing frequency of unauthorized distribution of sound recordings on the internet, plus, it seems, the strategic efforts of companies like Apple to suppress the price of complements, to fight the record companies, to keep the prices of the stuff they sell low, and to manufacture devices that tacitly, sometimes expressly, encourage people to rip, mix, burn, has created a disastrous state of affairs for a sector of the music industry, specifically the recording industry. So both nationally and globally, the revenues peaked in 1999, and they're now below half of where they were in 1999. So Chris, first question, turning this around, looking at through the lens not of Steve Jobs and his cohort, but a musician. So suppose a young, talented musician, meaning composer / performer, comes to you today and says, in this troubled legal and business environment, is it possible to create a career, or should I go to law school?
Or do both. I think it is, yeah, absolutely. Obviously, I think it's possible to create a career being a creative professional in music or in a lot of other places. I think that to sort of add to the mix of things that you described that were the underpinnings of this colossal problem, we had an industry that, at least as of the 1990s, and it's similar today in a lot of respects, but different in others, had kind of popped up in this very dispersed, distributed way with different companies, different players, different entities building businesses around different tiny, tiny slices of rights in music. So you referred in your example to someone who is both a songwriter and a performer, and the folks in this class will know that that's irrelevant because there are, in any piece of recorded music you have, there are two sets of rights. There's the right in the composition and then the separate right in the sound recording. And then you can subdivide that even further. So the right in the composition consists of a right to publicly perform that composition, which which is regulated by performance rights organizations like ASCAP and BMI and CSAC. The right to make a cover of, to mechanically reproduce and record a version of someone else's composition is frequently controlled by music publishers who have kind of developed their business around those rights. On the sound recording side, we have the record label. And you essentially have created this system where you have all of these players, none of whom has a holistic view of what's important in terms of the success of this artist. Not to mention sort of non-copyright pieces that go along with being a recorder and a performer and a songwriter, like the ability to tour and make revenue off of touring, the ability to sell merchandise like t-shirts with your name or face on it. Each of these stakeholders in this industry is looking out for his or her own interests. So if you're a music publisher, your interest is in maximizing publishing revenues related to, again, the mechanical reproduction or performance of songs. If you're a record label, you actually want publishers' rates to go way down, right? Because you're producing compact discs that embody these songs, you need to pay very low rates. And then add on top of this the fact that many of these entities, particularly record companies and publishers, are at the end of the day all part of the same company. You know, historically we had large companies that controlled both record labels and publishers under a single umbrella, each of whom had two very different competing sets of interests. So I would say that that it's a long way of saying that this complexity, I think, led historically to perhaps not, companies taking a long view, or people who own or control rights taking a long view or a holistic view of the success of an artist, and the reason why I think at the end of the day I would tell an artist, yes, there is a possibility for you to have a career and do well, is that there are opportunities now to take more, to kind of amass these rights together, either yourself as an artist or to work with a company that's going to do a deal with you that is much more like a traditional deal that a venture capitalist would do to a company. Not say the record label is going to take the recording rights and the publisher is going to take the composition and you're going to sign up with the PRO for this, but say, I'm going to invest X amount of dollars in you as an artist and I'm going to take Y percentage of revenue out of everything you do. I don't care if you sell a t-shirt or play a concert or license your recording to be aired in a popular television show. Any of those revenue streams I'll take a little bit out, and by making this big investment in you, I will provide you with the capital that you need to pay your mortgage and buy food and do all the things that you need to do. Yes, I think that possibility is out there, and I actually think it's almost more a question of business models in some ways than copyright.
Okay, a little more specifics here.
Mm-hmm.
Are you suggesting that through these, I gather these are what are referred to as 360 deals,
Yep.
there are just as many, maybe even better opportunities available for musicians? Just the sources of revenue are different, less fragmented, more coherent, things are actually just fine?
No, I don't think I'd say things are just fine, but I would say, so, and 360 deals are one piece of it. So 360 deal is the notion from a record label that they're going to come along and take an interest in each of these revenue streams. But there are, in addition to that, I think increasing opportunities for artists to go it on their own, not sign a 360 deal with anyone in particular, but to kind of manage themselves the functions that were historically handled by signing deals with these particular companies. You know, major record companies no longer have an exclusive lock on the distribution of your recordings like they used to. It used to be that if you wanted your record to get into Tower Records, you had to do a deal with a major record company. Now you can put your recording online yourself. Lots of interesting questions about how you market that, obviously, and how you get people to pay attention to you. But the distribution chain itself has been democratized so that the artist can do that directly. The artist has opportunities to run his or her own merchandising, again, through proxies. So I think 360 deals are one piece of it, but I think in general, there are business opportunities now for artists to do this stuff more on their own.
Which I suppose would be the potential explanation for why, despite the fact that there's only half as much money flowing into the large pot, the musicians could come out as well as before.
They could, yes. I mean, I think there's lots of talk these days about whether all of the new digital services that are coming along are setting the royalty rates correctly, or the subscriber rates that we pay to the Spotifys or that of the world, to make sure that at the end of the day, enough money is ending up in the musician's hands. But yeah, I think that potential is at least there.
Okay, one more question along this line,
Yep.
then we're going to turn to Jeffrey. Felix, why isn't Apple investing in musicians?
Oh, it's from Apple's perspective, it's the losing end of the business. And it seems a relatively, your business thrives in part because the price of content falls. But let me add something to what Chris says, this shift in the source of revenue. So you've gone to concerts lately, I'm sure. You must have noticed that tickets are pretty expensive now. That is just the dynamic that mimics the dynamic at Apple. Right? So content is free. iPod, iPhones, we pay pretty steep prices. Same dynamic. Content is free. The price of concert tickets goes up. We have a colleague in the Harvard Economics Department that has looked at artists, not a huge set of artists, but sort of in the middle of the distribution of skills, and her results suggest that incomes for this group have gone up by about 25%. And the reason is just that from the revenue of a CD, I got a really tiny share. I got maybe $1 or so. Concert revenue is much more evenly split. So as the profit pool shifts from content to concerts, that's actually great for artists. And the result is an explosion in the quantity of music that is supplied. I mean, the interesting thing is the moment copyright becomes weak, the moment copyright goes away, we see this explosion in the number of albums. And so I loved how you started us out thinking about the supply side issues that copyright is supposed to address. In many discussions, which I never quite understand, we talk about copyright as if it was Social Security for some group. Oh my God, what are the artists going to do if there's no X, Y, Z? No, we're talking about supply. As long as we have supply, and by all accounts, we're doing a better job supply-wise than we used to, there is no issue. In fact, it suggests that copyright was just too stringent, that the terms were too generous, because much of it was provided either, I would argue, for non-monetary reasons to begin with, playing in a restaurant at night and the beer and the camaraderie and everything. It's just fun. To people too, lots of the part of the sort of the economic view, the damage that the economic view of copyright has done is to suggest that people really do only things when they're paid. The moment financial incentives go away, we see creativity, we see artistic output go to zero. I think that's a completely wrong view. The shift towards complements on top of that, and we have a music scene that is really far better than the music scene we had when the majors were in control.
Jeffrey, I want to come back to the domain introduced by Stuart, the academic domain. Could you describe one of your projects under the general heading of digital humanities, and then address the natural next question: in what ways, if any, did the copyright regime either facilitate or impede the project?
Yeah, sure. And hopefully this will actually loop right back to the very important point Felix was making right now. One of the profound shifts in the cultural sphere that's been happening over the course of the World Wide Web era is that vast quantities of cultural material have been gradually migrating out of storage bins and guardian institutions out into a public space, into the web. And by the way, that's less than the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the percentage still vis-a-vis the entire cultural record is still minuscule. And yet, the mere fact that these vast repositories in the form of the kind of contents of museums that sit in museum storage facilities in basements or are hanging on the walls, collections of paintings, artworks, collections that are object-based, photographic archives, and so on and so forth, that these materials are gradually being released, digitized, published in some kind of form, creates this extraordinary opportunity for people working in cultural fields. But it's taken some 20 years of negotiation to even gain an understanding of what it means to actually create some kind of mode of access through a cultural portal of one kind or another. And museums themselves are engaged in an ongoing battle. It's still not entirely resolved over the degree to which they actually have copyright ownership of the objects that they're custodians of. You may be familiar with it. There have been a couple of major disputes. Most of them have, I think over the last 3 or 4 years, the sort of open culture movement, which is my wing of Stu's open knowledge, open scholarship movement, has really started to turn the tide. But there were some famous occasions in which archaeological museums, for instance, claimed that the mere fact that they had ownership of an object meant that they had complete control over all representations of that object. And that meant that when I, as a scholar, published my book on excavations in northern Mycenae with Oxford University Press, I would have to get permission, pay permissions to the holding institution for an object that very likely came up in the context of an archaeological dig in the late 19th century, at a kind of randomly discovered, maybe a pillaged object in many cases. That moment has really shifted over time. And a lot of the kinds of projects that I've been involved in as somebody who's interested in experimental modes of scholarly inquiry that tap into the tremendous potential of being able to work with very, very large cultural databases, you might say. This kind of expanded cultural field that really is expanding by the day, by the week, as museums begin to, in a sense, open source their open up access to their collections, is all of the kind of work one can do with the data sets that accompany those objects, to describe them, that allow us to view them, to interpret them, to compare them to other collections, to other categories of objects. They all depend upon access to the data sets and access to the objects, and to some set of understandings about the usage of them. What is a form of inquiry that not only doesn't compromise the commercial value or value in some sense of the objects. I mean, we as a scholar community have been arguing that if anything, scholarship is about adding value to objects. Objects that solely sit in storage are not, their value is not being preserved, actually. It's being diminished. And it's by the kind of beehive, the buzz of activity within a research community around cultural collections that we animate them, we bring them to life, we add value to them, we create, in a sense, audiences for them. So an example of a project is a project we have underway right now at MetaLab, which is called Curarium. And what it is it's a software platform, a web platform, that allows museums to take their inventory systems, which are typically proprietary systems, systems that are basically intranet type inventory systems for describing their collections. They contain provenance data, they identify objects, they classify them by media type. They basically tell the equivalent of a kind of library system, a sort of digital card catalog, you might say. But typically these systems are inward facing. They're not open to the public. What Curarium allows one to do is to ingest all of the data from those data repositories, which are tremendously rich descriptions of vast numbers of objects, and to turn those data, as well as the objects that they refer to through thumbnails or photographic illustrations or other kinds of forms of documentation, to make them usable for communities of interpreters and researchers, to make them teachable, to allow you to do things with them. And among the things that I think are really rich are the possibility of using data visualization tools to actually see things about collections that the very holding institutions can't see. Because if you're the Smithsonian and you have a collection that it numbers in the millions and millions and millions of objects, nobody in the entire institution can actually have ever experienced even a percentage of those objects. Many of those objects, in the case of the Smithsonian, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the percentage is something like 85% have been in deep storage throughout the course of their entire history. They've never been exhibited in any way. If I can take the vast treasury of these materials and do something with it that allows me not only to perhaps discover those nooks and crannies where there's real value to be added or real discoveries to be made, but also to see those objects from angles that no human being cognitively could conceivably do, because we're talking about millions of objects, not dozens of objects. That starts to create an extraordinary and even a transformative opportunity. But of course, copyright is right at the core of this question, because if I can't do things, if I can't do research, if I can't ask research questions of those data sets, if I can't call up those objects and turn them into teachable objects, into social objects, I'm dead in the water. And this has been a continuing battle within cultural institutions. But the tide, as I was saying, has really turned towards opening up access increasingly even to those kinds of internal resources that were the inventory systems for museum collections.
Okay, I have two follow-up questions. First is, a few years ago, I was giving a talk in Lithuania, and a curator of a collection, exactly what it was, I can't remember now, explained that the institution was investing a lot of money in bringing to light the collection, which involved, I guess, organizing, classifying, adding metadata, preserving. I and a few other people at this conference urged her, having made this great cultural gesture, to make it available to the world. She bridled for two reasons. One was, we don't have any money in this museum in Lithuania. Unless we can charge people for some access, we're never going to do this again. I mean, we've already spent the money on this particular collection, but we're never going to do it again. We need some money. Okay, that's number one. Second one, we worked hard on this. We deserve something. What do you mean give it away to the world? You would say to her?
I would make the argument that if what she's concerned with is some kind of institutionally sustainable model,
yeah,
that getting your collections out into social circulation is the most powerful tool that you have to actually bring visitors into your institution, because digital representations are not substitutes for the experience of physical objects. They are impoverished doubles, and yet they can circulate under conditions that are different, access conditions. I think you probably all experienced this, that it used to be that the visit to a cultural institution was the only moment, in a sense. But now we anticipate, the timeline is more fluid now. We actually visit before we go somewhere. We have a first experience of a place where we're going to have, an artistic or a cultural or a social experience. Then the actual physical event happens. And then there's its aftermath, which often includes returning to that space, re-engaging with it, engaging in a kind of broader social conversation. So I think the basic boundaries of institutions are being reconceptualized around this more fluid model. And just to come back to Felix's point, which I think is really fundamental, culture is about copying. It has always been based, all areas of culture are based on forms of imitation and copying. The copyright system comes very late in the history of humankind. It's a kind of exotic outlier vis-a-vis what are some fundamental aspects of the way culture works. And I think that isn't to say that the copyright cannot play a powerful role in enabling certain forms of practice, but I think ultimately the system has revealed itself to be increasingly in tension with certain basic models of how creativity is actually practiced, and has been practiced throughout all cultures and throughout all historical epochs. And so I think in a paradoxical way, this sort of shifts the expansion of the public sphere that the web as the kind of defining public space of our time has had is actually put pressure on these cultural institutions that were asking the kinds of questions you were just asking about. How do you sustain an engagement with an audience? I think open access is your best friend. That would be my argument.
Okay. Questions, reactions?
I have a question to follow up to one of those last points that you just Yep. Okay. So just to follow up on one of those points, when you say that culture has always been about copying and that copyright is a recent development, I mean, can you talk about some of the historical you know, if there was not copyright, I'm guessing that maybe, you know, maybe there were some other cultural conventions that, you know, sort of frowned upon just, you know, totally pilfering somebody's work. And I'm just wondering if you have much familiarity with some of these, you know, historical, cultural you know, modes of production and sort of recognizing people's artistic contributions and enforcing these boundaries, if there were any, across different cultures?
It's a great question. I think it may be worth, my own training, initial training is as a medievalist, and the medieval context, it could hardly be more radically opposed than to the present situation. But in the history of educational practices, in the history of all kinds of cultural forms, from the visual arts to literary sphere to other spheres, copying and imitation were always the foundation stone for how you train people, how people acquire arts. And the word copia comes from copiousness. So the copy was what guaranteed the survival of a cultural form. And that was the standard assumption in the early modern world, that a copy is good. A copy adds value, because without the copy, works face that inevitable destiny that was the true fear of people in the pre-modern world, which was that works would disappear. The assumption was that there would be a kind of scarcity, and therefore, not only was copying integral to educational institutions, that's how you learned rhetoric, how you became a lawyer. It was you imitated speeches, you re-performed them, and that act of re-performance was always understood to involve transformation also. And therefore, the kind of life of a text, the life of an artwork, was thought to be inevitably, ideally, to be part of a sequence of acts of imitation. And therefore, it would have seemed very strange to somebody in the era of Petrarch or Boccaccio, for instance, to imagine a copyist as somehow a threat to his literary reputation. On the contrary, authors in, say, the 14th to the 15th century would have been concerned with the quality of the copy, but the more copies, the better. As printing develops during the Renaissance and into the Baroque period, it's typically publishers who operate very freely vis-a-vis authors. Authors have very fluid and unpredictable sorts of degrees of control over printing practices. Musicians had close to zero sense of property. Musical traditions tend to be all about imitation and copying in the most literal sense, about forms of re-performance, remixing in a sense. So it's really in the 19th century that we begin to get this more consolidated notion of copyright. And I think there are some deep aspects of copyright that democratize, at least had a kind of instinct to kind of democratize and locate rights, if you like, in individuals who, within a more fluid system like the one I was evoking, often lost out, and authors were among them. In the sort of pre-copyright regime of printing, authors, especially in the 18th century, as printing began to become industrialized, they suffered a lot as publishers abused the fact that there were almost no controls on who could turn out an edition. Bad editions were literally copied, churned out without any benefit whatsoever to authors. So there were some of those protections that I think are inspired by the kind of chaos that was inevitable in a system with such fluid relationships like the one I was evoking. But whether that means that a system that acknowledges those rights should have a duration of the lifetime of the creator or 75 years after the moment of publication. I mean, those are very different propositions in my view. And they have very profound cultural ramifications. And I'll just give you one example that is one that strikes me constantly. This is a golden era for 19th century studies. Google Books is filled with, for the second half of the 19th century, an amazing proliferation of books that are hard-to-find books on almost any subject you can imagine. But the good news runs out in 1927. And we face the same problem in a wide range of cultural fields. Contemporary art, very difficult field to work in. Why? Control over images. But if you work on the late 19th century, you have this extraordinary set of resources that have been democratized, made available in forms that you can ask research questions of that are really, innovative and different from the kinds of questions you could ask only 50 years ago. So this question of, there are consequences, in other words, to these shifts, and they produce perverse effects in terms of the cultural field.
So from our online audiences, Alan Mizraki asks a question that arguably implicates the special character of academic institutions as arenas in which copyright arises. So I'm going to combine Alan's question with one provoked, actually, Jeffrey, by your last comment. I'm going to direct it to Stuart. So one might argue that academic institutions are unusual among institutions related to copyright in their lawlessness. So, for example, in the field of science, scientific researchers within academic institutions are notorious for cavalierly ignoring patent rights. Typically, at Harvard and many other institutions, scientists working in their labs regularly make use of patented research tools without compensating anybody. And there's a custom of tolerating this every once in a while, as was Duke. The custom breaks down, but for the most part, just lawlessness. Arguably, if you study the behavior of Harvard Law School faculty in making course materials available, it's outrageous. Okay, so one view of the academic institution is it's special in its lawlessness. Alan asked the converse question and says, well, are some, roughly speaking, academic institutions moving in the opposite direction, asserting increasingly through copyright claims over things produced by their members, including their students? The example he points to is the Prince George's County in Maryland attempting to assert copyright over their students' and academic staff's work. So this depicts schools as the opposite of lawless. Here it's those that try to educate the kindergartners in their copyright entitlements and more directly exert claims over the work of their underlings. So which is it?
So it's a very good question, and I suppose it's an empirical question, and I don't have the empirical answer. I haven't, you'd have to survey what's going on to the extent that Prince George's is claiming rights in their students' work, which I suppose they could do in the sense that they could make it a condition of matriculating that you sign over your rights in your work as a student to the university. I don't know if that's what they've done or not, but to the extent that they've done that, shame on them. It's a terrible thing. But again, it's an empirical question. To what extent that's happening, I don't know. What is their legal argument to claiming rights in the students' work?
Almost certainly, yes, it would be a licensing arrangement because they're the students rather than staff. Staff, they can sort of work for hire.
Staff is different, right? So if you're a staff member, there's many staff members here, members of the administration and so forth, and in the course of their work, they have to write a memo about such and such. Yeah. That seems like a standard work for hire to me, and the university would own the rights. It's different from a researcher writing an article, and you're going to say, in what legal sense is it? I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have to answer that question. But certainly, by virtue of custom, that hasn't been the case. That the researchers somehow or other retain the copyright in their work, which they then sign over to publishers who limit access to those works.
So let's pursue this from a policy standpoint, not a legal standpoint. Okay. In one step further, as you know, this is a relatively novel enterprise we're engaged in here. It's a foray into the distance learning environment, and it therefore raises questions within academic institutions that press on these themes. Yeah. And in particular, the custom, partially, equivocally backed by law, of tolerating faculty members' complete control one way or another over their works, as contrasted with staff, where the university asserts control. That differentiation is breaking down when we produce things like the film that's generated right now is less my property than would have been standard 5 years ago.
Right.
Is this good or bad?
Yeah, so I think the thing to do is to think about so the way to evaluate whether it's good or bad is not to look, is do exactly what you said. Don't look at the legal regime. Look at the underlying motivation and think about what is going to happen to the incentives to do all of the various activities that university participants are supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. If you go too far in a certain direction, will the smart experts who you would like to become faculty members say, no, I'm not going to do that anymore because I have no control over over my writing or my lectures or my course notes or whatever. Not that I want the control so that I can limit access, but so that I can make sure that other people don't limit access. And so this is these battles play out over time, and I'm loath to. This one's beginning to play out. Yeah, I'm loath to make predictions over where things will end.
Adrienne.
So I have a follow-up question to that. As I think most people here know, in the realm of law, many of the editing roles that are traditionally occupied by publishers and their peer review networks are actually taken on by students. As a result, law review publishers do little more than actually print physical copies of law reviews, and this perhaps explains why, as far as I understand at least, the university that hosts any given law review will actually hold the copyright in that journal. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to why such a model has not emerged in other fields, if it should, and if this might be one way to allow faculty to maintain greater control over how their works can be accessed by the public.
So is the issue you're raising whether it would be a good thing for universities to become the publishers of scholarly journals, as they basically are with law reviews? Is that the question?
Well, I wouldn't say that the universities are the publishers of law reviews, because there are still publishers that actually print the copies, but the universities do hold the copyrights in the journals, whereas the authors maintain the copyrights in their articles. But ultimately, it will be up to the university how they license out the rights, any right requests, any license requests that come in for the journal.
You know, you've hit on an issue that's extremely topical. There's a lot of interest at universities, especially at libraries, academic libraries in universities, research libraries, in somehow taking on this publishing role. And the issue you're talking about with the printing, I don't think of the printing as the publishing. First of all, to first approximation, scholarly journals these days are not used by virtue of having been centrally printed on paper. The distribution is almost entirely electronic. So this distinction between, for instance, print journals and they're sometimes called electronic journals, is a terrible term. It's irrelevant. All journals are electronic journals now. There's a few little fields where that hasn't happened yet. So the printing is irrelevant. The issue is who's controlling this process and controlling the rights. So there's a lot of interest in universities in taking on this role of publishers because they see the problems that have arisen when we sign over those rights to, especially to large commercial publishers, all the ill effects that have happened, which I can detail for you if you're interested. I'm actually a little contrarian on this point. I've never been a big fan of this idea. And the reason is I don't see any reason to expect that universities have any particular expertise at being publishers. Universities have expertise at teaching and research. And I'd be very happy to leave the publishing part, the management of all those processes, and the occasional printing where that happens, to the people who know how to do that. That's the publishers. The problem isn't who's doing it. The problem is the business model and the rights situation that relates to it, on which the whole system is built. So we need to find a different way of dealing with rights and dealing with a business model. Not a business model where the authors pay the publishers with our copyright, then the publishers use their monopoly rights that they got in the copyright to limit access to those libraries that are willing and able to pay. So the whole system is based on limiting access, despite the manifest interests of the authors in the first place who didn't want any access limitations. It'd be much better to have a business model where the authors or the authors' proxies, the universities, pay the publishers to go through the publication process and make it available to everyone for free. That's the open access journal model. Many, many good things follow from that, not the least of which is the open access. But also it turns out that the market structure is much better and there's lots of advantages. So I don't think the problem is who's doing the work. I think it'd be fine to have commercial publishers doing the work if they're doing it in a market structure that isn't dysfunctional, like the current academic market structure is.
I also really appreciated the comment that copyright is a strange modern outlier in the realm of how we deal with culture. And we happen to live in a relatively federated world with lots of separate jurisdictions, even within some countries. The countries are broken up into lots of pretty independent groups. This is partly a legal question, but really more a cultural question for me. Are there communities that deal with some of these issues in a sensible way? That say, here's a class of culture or knowledge that is simply not copyrighted. And how much does it cost to move there?
I'm not sure if the question was addressed to me, but I will jump on it because I think it's a great question. I think de facto such communities are very much part of our own contemporary landscape. What we sometimes like to call feral copyright, sort of copyright in the wild, the way it's actually being applied or misapplied or interpreted or perverted by communities. I think in internet culture in particular, we see niche communities that are creating their own rules, irrespective of what the public rules. The downside, in terms of coming back to your question, is of course that they're largely outlaw communities. So how do we build a series of legal models that can perhaps accommodate the very distinctive special needs and the advantages, the social advantages to embracing a different concept? I think in the music world, we have the most dramatic expression of that, as I think Chris was hinting at least. But we see it also in, what really strikes me as somebody who is always approaching these issues from a kind of standpoint where it's the sort of don't ask, don't tell approach to intellectual property. But certainly don't ask the legal counsel of the university because the answer will always be discouraging. That actually these communities of practice that are in violation of the letter of the law, most of them continue to thrive and exist despite it's only when you touch the third rail of highly sensitive or valuable intellectual property that that these two cultures come into an open collision that turns into a lawsuit. And even areas like film, for instance, I ran a project at the Stanford Humanities Lab where we did this curatorial project on the history of the cinema and representations of multitudes in the cinema. A series of curated micro galleries with hours of film footage ripped from, DVDs and videos. In the course of 11 years that website was up, we never once got a single query from the film industry.
So
Yeah.
I would follow up that. Incidentally, Sam, I think implicit in this is you don't need to move anywhere. Just keep your laptop open and it's fine. Here's an argument from the other side. Increasingly now, with the failure of traditional legal enforcement mechanisms, the companies who stand to gain from monetizing their products, with the aid sometimes of Congress, have turned to technological systems that have the effect of over-enforcing rather than under-enforcing. A simple example is the recording of the first of the events this year, which most of you in the room will remember. This is Joshua Redman. You remember that when Joshua Redman was here, I asked him a question about the way in which he constructed a pattern of improvisation on the basis of a blonde redhead song. And he played the song. I played an excerpt of it on the system in the room, and then he played it on the piano, and then he created on the spot an improvisation. If you look at the recording now of that event here in this room on YouTube, you will see there's an advertisement on it. Why is there an advertisement? There's an advertisement because Blonde Redhead registered with YouTube a copyright claim. Not they didn't want to have it taken down. They wanted to monetize it. And it is processed now through the monetization engine. Now, for those, I think pretty much everybody in the room knows, this is a classic case of fair use. The use of an excerpt in an academic setting to demonstrate improvisation is way over on the uncertain spectrum of fair use. This is way over on the legal side. But the automated systems for detecting infringement and then converting it into money pick it up. We could fight. We did fight 2 of these last year, which were more serious. They resulted in takedowns rather than monetization. But, why fight? The ad isn't too intrusive. So the culture may be feral and disobedient, but the technology is the opposite. I want to, we don't have too much more time here. I want to change gears a little bit and take up a legal policy question for both Felix. I want to direct it to both Felix and Chris. So this requires a little bit of background because not everybody either in the room or online knows the context here. So here's the context. For a very long time, one of the ways in which television shows and movies have been monetized has been free over-the-air broadcasting with embedded advertisements. The money is then rerouted to the creators when customers buy the products that are advertised in the shows. Decades ago, cable television companies began supplying better quality service to their customers by picking up these signals out of the airwaves and retransmitting them through cables to homes where they could watch the same shows in higher quality. Initially, the cable companies refused to pay any money, saying, hey, we're just picking up the free broadcast like anybody else. Why should we have to pay you anything more? And the courts agreed. Yeah, fine. Congress changed the rules in a very complicated way, but for our purposes here, there's only the simple point is the relevant one. Cable companies now have to pay money, independent of the advertisements that are embedded in these things. And there are thriving cable companies that are founded on this regime and pay regularly hundreds of millions of dollars to the creators. Recently, a set of companies, the most famous of which is Aereo, located in a Second Circuit opinion a possible end run around this regime in which they could avoid, they thought, and still do think, paying these fees if instead of having a single antenna that captures the stuff over the airways and channels it through the lines to the homes, they had thousands of little antennas, each one of which was connected, at least briefly, to a recording device that converted the signal into the packets that are then sent over the internet to subscribers. So this company collects money from subscribers, but claims the legal status of individual recipient, and so is not paying the. Okay, so as most of you know, this case is now before the Supreme Court. Are we going to allow this to go forward or not? So, putting aside the technical questions.
Because I'm a subscriber.
I see. Oh, okay. So you have to recuse yourself, I guess. Yeah.
Interesting.
Parenthetically, when the Sony Betamax case was decided by the United States Supreme Court, 3 United States Supreme Court justices owned VCRs and did not recuse themselves. So feel free to participate in the discussion. So should we, from a policy standpoint, applaud this as yet another manifestation of relaxation of needless monetization of what should be an open cultural form? Or should we conversely regard it as yet another sign of the destruction of the essential legal protections for creators? Either Felix or Chris or both.
Well, from the legal side, I'll say that what Aereo did was to thread a needle that had been laid before them by a previous case, the Cablevision case in the Second Circuit, that talked very explicitly about this issue of, in that case, it was not many antennas, but the question was about whether if I have a DVR that sits on my TV stand at home that I can use to record TV programs, whether it really matters whether that DVR sits in my home or is connected by a long wire back to a central warehouse that the cable company maintains. And the court in Cablevision basically said, as long as there are many DVRs, as long as each of us has our own DVR sitting back home at the warehouse and there's not a single DVR that's feeding all of us, then we're okay. Cablevision's okay for offering that service. It's the most monumentally inefficient way you could possibly imagine to offer the service, as Aereo is the most monumentally inefficient way you could imagine to offer TV service, over-the-air TV service to people online. But
so they should be punished for their inefficiency?
Right. Well, yeah. Or they should be. They should not be punished. They should be, I guess, applauded for attempting to thread this needle and given and following the rules that were given to them. It seems very likely to me that if Aereo goes the way of Aereo, that we're going to see some sort of a legislative fix afterwards to try and clean this up. Aereo notably did not oppose this, even though they had won, at least in the Second Circuit cases, the cases below, they did not oppose the application to take this to the U.S. Supreme Court because, again, this is a bet the company and, in fact, bet the entire business model proposition to see whether this works. So from a legal perspective, it's an example of the Copyright Act, a case that built on top of the Copyright Act and then attempting to follow that case, I guess.
Okay, that's very helpful from a doctrinal standpoint, but now let's turn it back into a policy issue that can be engaged in with everybody in the panel. So here would be a way of doing so. However the decision comes out, there's a good chance that the Judiciary Committee will convene a consideration of a statutory modification. You've been asked to advise the committee. What do you say?
It's difficult to separate the policy, I think, from the technical aspects and the aspects under the copyright law. But at the end of the day, if what we're talking about here is a business model that's premised on getting eyeballs on TV to support advertising, then it doesn't seem to me to particularly matter whether those signals are carried over the air and then through a cable. It's still an advertising-based model, and the money is not going to pay content owners. It's going to rent this antenna or rent access to the antenna. So I think that an argument could be made that this is acceptable, and they're taking advantage, again, of things that are being put out for free on the premise that lots of people are watching them, and therefore that's where the ad revenue comes from. I don't think that that's the way it will go. I think that argument could be made.
So Felix, you're asked the same question by the Judiciary Committee. What do you say?
So I think that the relevant consideration, as always, is how is the content, how are the shows that are available on TV, how are they going to change? For sure, if I'm a cable company and now I have a competitor that doesn't have to pay a fee that I pay, that is going to change market shares, is going to change financing opportunities. And we want to ask, is this effect big enough to perhaps degrade the quality of content on TV, or perhaps to make obsolete entire parts of the programming or very hard to finance, such that we as a society say it's good for us to keep up copyright, perhaps not in quite as inefficient a manner as we currently do, but in order to get the kind of content that we want. So maybe, we have lots of examples tonight. We know there's great, going back to the cultural question, there's great research that says copyright got more stringent mid-19th century, and the flurry in British literature was in part a response to exactly this tightening of the copyright regime. So we did get different content. We always get different content. And the question is, well, now that, say, musicians finance their livelihood by being concerts, that's probably great if I'm in electronic music. I can well imagine that there are pieces of music or genres of music where this doesn't work very well because, frankly, no one goes to concerts. And yet we, as a society, value these pieces of content. So the question before us, I think, and I would almost, luckily I understand neither the law nor the technology, so I'm free to judge here. But I would always approach it from the angle, how does the availability of content change? And we as a society, in that sense, it's not a technical question. We need to say, do we have enough modern composition? Or do we have too little? In which case, we will want to find, hopefully, efficient means to subsidize production. Sometimes market power is a very efficient way to subsidize production.
Seems like a very good place to stop. Thank you all for coming.